The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe. Part 1. In the Warmth of the Fire. After a series of misfortunes reduced his once wealthy family to near poverty, William Legrand left his native city of New Orleans, Louisiana. He was depressed and discouraged, too ashamed of his misfortunes to face old friends. With one companion, Legrand came to live on Sullivan's Island, near Charleston, South Carolina. His single companion was Jupiter, an elderly slave who had been given his freedom before the loss of the family fortune. Because of his concern for his former master and because he was too old to enter a new occupation, Jupiter had decided to accompany Legrand and look after him. Sullivan's Island is about 3 miles long and a quarter of a mile wide. A narrow creek oozes its way through weeds and slime along one long side and separates the island from the South Carolina mainland. The opposite side of the island faces the sea. Because the sea is almost all sand, there are few trees or plants. At the western end of the island is Fort Moultrie, and here, amid several small summer cottages, stand a few clusters of the bristly palmetto, a small palm tree with fan-shaped leaves. The rest of the island is covered with sweet myrtle, a shrub which fills the air with its fragrance and manages somehow to grow quite thick and quite tall, sometimes 15 or 20 feet. Legrand and Jupiter had built a small hut in the midst of this tall, thick shrubbery at the eastern end of the island. I was living in Charleston at the time, but my love of nature often took me across the creek to the island. Although Legrand was called by some a hermit, we had met during one of my visits and became friends. He had an unusually keen mind and was very well educated. He was, though, a strangely moody person who could jump with enthusiasm at one moment and become silent and melancholy the next. This was due, I always supposed, to the changes in his family's fortune. But he seemed to look forward to my occasional visits to his hut, and I enjoyed his company. Others might have thought his existence an isolated one, but Legrand actually kept quite busy. His chief amusements were hunting and fishing, or walking along the beach and through the myrtles, searching for shells and insect specimens. He had quite a fine collection of both, and was very knowledgeable about the entomology of the study of insect life. One October day, a few years ago, 1840 I think it was, I decided to visit my friend, whom I had not seen in several weeks. Usually the weather on Sullivan's Island is quite mild even in the winter. In the autumn it is seldom necessary to light a fire, but this day was quite chilly. Just before sunset I reached the hut. I rapped, as I usually did, but there was no reply. I knew where the key was hidden, so I unlocked the door and went in. A fine fire was blazing upon the hearth, a most welcome sight, although an unusual one here. I sat down gratefully in an armchair near the crackling logs, and in a little while my hosts arrived. They greeted me cordially, and Jupiter, grinning from ear to ear, bustled about to prepare supper. Legrand was in one of his moods of enthusiasm. He had found a new king of shell, even more exciting, a scarab, a kind of black-winged beetle once considered sacred by the ancient Egyptians. I believe this scarab to be totally new, never described by any scientist before. He shouted joyfully, "And I hope to have your opinion about it tomorrow." "And why not tonight?" I inquired, rubbing my hands over the blaze. "Ah, if only I knew you were coming," answered Legrand. "But it's been so long since I've seen you. How could I have guessed that you would visit me this very night? On the way home I met Lieutenant Gray from Fort Moultrie. You know how interested he is in the natural science. Foolishly I lent him the bug, so it will be impossible for you to see it until morning. Stay here tonight, and I will send Jupiter for it at sunrise. It is the loveliest thing in creation." "What is the loveliest? The sunrise?" "No, the bug, of course. It's a brilliant gold color, about the size of a large hickory nut. It has 2 jet black spots at one end of its back, and a single long black spot at the other end. The antennae are—" "It's a gold bug, Mr. Will," cut in Jupiter. "Solid gold, every bit of 'em, inside and all, 'cept the wing. I never felt such a heavy bug in my life." "Well, I suppose it is, Jupe," returned Legrand. "Is that any reason for letting our dinner burn? The color." Here he returned to me. "The color is really close to Jupiter's description. The scales have the most brilliant metallic shine. You see for yourself tomorrow. In the meantime, This will give you some ideas of the shape." Saying this, he sat down at a small table. On it were pen and ink, but no paper. He hunted in his pockets until he found what looked like a scrap of dirty notepaper. "Never mind," he said. "I'll use this." And on the notepaper, he made a rough drawing with his pen. When he had finished sketching, he handed it to me without rising. I returned to my seat by the fire, for I was still chilled after my long walk. As I took the drawing, I heard a loud growl and the sound of scratching at the door. Jupiter went to open it, and a large dog rushed in. This was Wolf, Legrand's Newfoundland, to whom I had given much attention on my earlier visits. The dog now leaped upon my shoulders and loaded me with caresses. After Wolf and I frolicked a bit, I turned my attention to Legrand's drawing. To tell the truth, I was quite puzzled at what I saw. "Well?" "Well," I exclaimed after studying the paper for some minutes. "This is a strange scarab, I agree. I never saw anything like it before. Unless it was a death's head. A skull, that's what it looks like to me." "A death's head!" repeated Legrand in surprise. "Oh, yes. Well, I guess it does look something like that on paper. The two upper black spots look like eyes, eh? And the longer one on the bottom like a mouth, and then the shape of the whole is oval." "Perhaps so," I said. "But, Legrand, I can see you are not an artist. I'll just have to wait to see the beetle itself." "Not an artist?" he repeated. "I always thought I could draw fairly well." He was clearly offended. "I had some good teachers at one time." "But you must be joking then," I said. "This is a very fine drawing of a skull. Your beetle must be the queerest scarab in the world to resemble it. But where are the antennae you spoke of?" "The antenna!" Legrand was all but shouting now. "You must see the antenna. I drew them quite distinctively." "Perhaps so," I said as soothingly as I could. "Perhaps you have, but I still don't see them." Without further comment, I handed him the paper. I was quite surprised at his change of mood. And as for the drawing of the beetle, there was positively no antenna, and the thing did look very like a death's head. He took the paper with a look of annoyance, and was about to crumple it up and throw it into the fire, when a quick glance at the design seemed to startle him. His face grew red. Then he turned quite pale. Sitting quite still at the table, he studied the drawing carefully. Then he stood up, and taking a candle from the table, went to sit down upon a sea chest in the farthest corner of the room. Here again he studied the paper carefully, turning it in all directions. However, he didn't say a word. I was quite amazed at his behavior, but thought it best not to risk irritating him any further. So I remained silent also. Presently he took a wallet from his pocket and placed the paper carefully in it. He unlocked the writing desk and placed the wallet inside, locking it again. Now he grew calmer, but the enthusiasm he had shown earlier in the evening was gone. As the evening wore on, he became more and more absorbed in his own thoughts, and no conversation of mine could arouse him. I had planned to spend the night at the hut, as I had often done before, but because of Legrand's mood I decided to leave. He did not insist on me staying, but as I left he shook my hand with what seemed to me to be a highly emotional grip. For the next month I did not see Legrand. Then one day Jupiter appeared at my home in Charleston. He looked so downcast that I feared some serious disaster had occurred. "Welcome, Jupe," I said. "But what is the matter? How is Mr. Will?" "To tell the truth, sir, he's not too well. Not too well at all." "Not well? I'm sorry to hear it. What does he complain of?" "There, that's it," exclaimed Jupiter. "He never complains of a thing, but I can tell he's very sick." "Very sick, Jupiter? Why don't you say so at once?" "Why, sir, it's nothing to get excited about. Mr. Will says nothing the matter with him. But then, why does he walk about with his head down and his shoulders up and his face as white as a ghost? Jupiter, haven't you any idea what is causing this? Has anything unpleasant happened since I saw you?" "No, sir. Hasn't been anything unpleasant since then. It was before then, and it was the very day you were there." "How? What do you mean?" "Why, sir, I mean the bug. The gold bug he found. I never did see such a devilish bug. It kicked and bit everything that come near it. Mr. Will caught it first, but he had to let it go again, mighty quick. I tell you, that was when he must have got bitten. I didn't like the look of the bug's mouth myself, to tell the truth, so I wouldn't grab him with my fingers. It Instead, I caught a hold of him with a piece of paper that I found. I wrapped him up in the paper and stuffed a piece of it in his mouth. And you really think that Mr. Will was bitten by the beetle, and that the bite made him sick? I don't think nothing about it. I know it, Jupiter answered emphatically. Why else do he dream about the gold so much? If it ain't because he was bit by the gold bug. I've heard about gold bugs before. How do you know he dreams about gold? How? Because he talks about it in his sleep. That's how. Well, Jupe, perhaps you're right. But about your coming here today, did you bring any message for me? Not a message, sir. I brought this letter. And here Jupiter handed me this note. My dear friend, since I saw you, I have had a great cause for anxiety. I have something to tell you. Yet I don't know how to tell it, or even whether I should tell it at all. I have not been quite well for some days past. I know poor old Jupe worries about me. I have not found anything new for my collection since you were here. If you possibly can, come back with Jupiter. Do come. I wish to see you tonight, upon business of the highest importance. Ever yours, William Legrand. The tone of this note made me very uneasy. It was so different from Legrand's usual style. What business of the highest importance could he possibly have with me? Jupiter's description of his condition worried me too. I was afraid that his misfortunes had finally unsettled his sanity. Without a moment's hesitation, therefore, I prepared to go back to the island with Jupiter. I agreed to meet him at the wharf in a short while. A scythe and 3 spades, all new, were lying in the bottom of the boat when I reached the wharf. What are these for, Jupiter? I asked. Mr. Will insisted I buy them in the town, and a lot of money I had to pay for them too. But what is he going to do with them? That's more than I know, Jupiter replied, but it's all because of that bug. It was clear that I was not going to get any information or satisfaction from Jupiter, for his mind seemed completely absorbed by the bug. So I stepped into the boat, and we set sail. With a strong breeze, we soon landed just north of Fort Montier on Sullivan's Island. A walk of some 2 miles brought us to the hut at about 3 in the afternoon. Legrand was eagerly waiting for us. Part 2 by Edgar Allan Poe. Beetle on a String. Legrand grasped my hand nervously. His face was pale, and his deep-set eyes seemed unusually bright, even glaring. Seeing his ghastly appearance, I shared Jupiter's concern about his health, but when I asked about it, Legrand brushed aside my questions. Not knowing what else to say, I asked if he had gotten the beetle back yet from Lieutenant Gray. "Oh, yes," he replied, and his face reddened. "I got it from him the next morning. Nothing will tempt me to part with the scarab ever again." "Do you know that Jupiter's quite right about it?" "How do you mean?" I asked, alarmed. "In saying it's real gold." He said this in such a serious tone that I was truly shocked. "This bug will make my fortune," he continued mysteriously, smiling in triumph. "It will restore my family possessions. Is it any wonder that I prize it? Since fortune has seen fit to give it to me, I must use it properly, and then I shall find the gold, for the gold bug is the key to it." At this Legrand rose, took the beetle from the glass case, and brought it to me. It was indeed a beautiful scarab, and, at that time, of a variety unknown to naturalists. Of course, it was a great prize from a scientific point of view. There were 2 round black spots near one end of the back, and a long black spot near the other end, just as he had described. The scales were hard and glossy, with all the appearance of polished gold. The weight of the insect was remarkable, too. And taking all things into consideration, I could hardly blame Jupiter for believing it was solid gold. But what was I to make of Legrand's agreeing with him? Surely even an amateur scientist would know better. "I sent for you," Legrand began dramatically in a strange booming voice, "to have your advice concerning fate and the bug, and—" "My dear Legrand," I interrupted, "you are certainly ill, and had better go to bed. I will stay with you a few days until you get over this. You are feverish and—" "Feel my pulse," he said, now back to his usual voice. I felt his pulse and, to tell the truth, found not the slightest indication of fever. "But you may be ill, and yet have no fever. First, go to bed, then—" "You are mistaken," he broke in. "I am as well as I can be under the circumstances. It is only the excitement which I feel. If you really want to help me, you will share this excitement." "And how can I do that?" "Very easily. Jupiter and I are going on an expedition into the hills on the mainland. We shall need help. You are the only one we can trust." It doesn't matter whether we succeed or fail. Either way, my excitement will be satisfied and I will rest easy." "I would do anything to help you," I replied. "But do you mean to say that this infernal beetle has something to do with your expedition into the hills?" "It has." "Then, Legrand, I cannot become a party to such an absurd expedition." "But it will only be for one night," he protested. "We shall start immediately and be back by sunrise." "And you will promise me, upon your honor, that when this madness of yours is over and the bug business settled, you will then return to your home and follow my advice until you recover?" Yes, I promise. Now let's be off. We have no time to lose." With a heavy heart, I accompanied my friend. We started at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Legrand, Jupiter, the dog, and myself. Jupiter insisted on carrying the scythe and the spades, more because he feared to trust Legrand with them than out of any zeal for hard work. I carried a couple of lanterns, while Legrand contented himself with carrying the scarab, which was attached to the end of a long length of cord. He twirled it to and fro as he walked, with the air of a sorcerer. I thought this was surely evidence of his loss of sanity, and I was terribly upset. But I didn't want to disturb his mind any more than it already was, so I reluctantly continued along in silence. We crossed the creek separating Sullivan's Island from the mainland in a small boat. Once ashore, we started climbing the high grounds, going in a northwesterly direction through a desolate stretch of countryside. No trace of a human step was to be seen. Legrand led the way, pausing only here and there to check out certain landmarks. After about 2 hours, when the sun was just setting, we entered an even drearier landscape. This was a flat region near the top of a heavily wooded hill. The thickly overgrown bramble bushes grew in between huge rocks on the hill. We had climbed onto a sort of natural platform, with Jupiter cutting our way through with the scythe, until we came to an enormously tall tulip tree, surrounded by 8 or 10 short oaks. Never did I see so tall a tree, nor one so beautiful in its foliage and form, in the wide spread of its branches, and in the general majesty of its appearance. Legrand turned to Jupiter. "Jup, do you think you can climb it?" he asked. The old man seemed a little staggered by the question. He walked slowly around the thick trunk and examined it closely. "Yes, Mr. Will, I can climb any tree I ever saw in my life." "Then up with you, and soon as possible. It will soon be too dark to see what we must see." "How far up must I go?" "Get up the main trunk first, and then I will tell you what to do. Here, wait. Take the beetle with you." "The bug, Mr. Will? The gold bug? What must I take that thing for?" "Jupe, if you are afraid, a great big fellow like you, to carry a harmless little dead beetle, why then you can hold it by this string. But if you do not take it up with you in some way, I shall have to break your head with this shovel." "I was just joking," exclaimed Jupiter. "What do I care about an old bug?" And saying this, he cautiously took hold of the end of the string, and keeping the insect as far from his body as possible, started up the tree. Young tulip trees have peculiarly smooth trunks. They often grow to a great height before their branches develop. At a riper age, the bark becomes gnarled and uneven, and many short limbs branch off from the main trunk. Thus it was not really difficult for Jupiter to get a footing, since the trunk, tall as it was a natural ladder. Jupiter reached the first large branch, some 60 or 70 feet from the ground, in short order. Wriggling himself into the fork of the branch and the trunk, he seemed to consider his mission accomplished. "What now, Mr. Will?" he called down. "Follow up the largest branch, the one on this side," called back Legrand. Jupiter obeyed him promptly, and apparently with little trouble. He climbed higher and higher until we could no longer see his squat figure through the thick foliage surrounding him. Presently we heard his voice. "How much further?" he called down. "How high are you?" asked Legrand. "I can see the sky through the top." "Never mind the sky," called back Legrand. "Listen carefully. Look down the trunk. Count the branches below you on this side. How many are there?" "1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 big ones on this side." "Then go 1 branch higher." In a few minutes Jupiter's voice was heard again, announcing that he was now on the 7th branch. "Now, Jupe," called Legrand excitedly, "I want you to work your way out upon that branch as far as you can. If you could see anything strange, let me know." By this time I was certain of my poor friend's insanity, and I became anxious about getting him home. "Most out to the end now." Jupiter's distant voice interrupted my thoughts. "Out to the end!" screamed Legrand. "Are you out to the end yet?" "Soon be out to the end, Mr. Will." "Oh, Lord God Almighty! What is this here on the tree?" "Well, what is it?" shouted back Legrand, suddenly seeming quite delighted. "Why, 'tain't nothing but a skull. Somebody left his head up in the tree, that's all, and the crows gobbled off every bit of meat." "A skull, you say? Now tell me, how is it fastened to the branch? What holds it on?" "Just a minute now. Let me look. Why, that's very strange. There's a big nail in the skull holding it onto the tree." "Now, Jupiter, can you hear me? Do exactly as I tell you." "Yes, Mr. Will." "Pay attention, then. Find the left eye of the skull. Do you know your right hand from your left?" "Yes, it's my left hand I chop wood with." "To be sure, you are left-handed, and your left eye is on the same side as your left hand. Now find the left eye of that skull." There was a long pause. "Have you found it yet?" called Legrand, anxiously. "Is the left eye of the skull on the same side as the left hand of the skull? 'Cause the skull ain't got a hand at all. Never mind, here's the left eye. Now what do I do with it?" "Drop the beetle through it. Let it drop down as far as the string will reach. But don't let go of the string until I tell you." "All done, Mr. Will. It was mighty easy putting the bug through the hole. Watch out for him below." As Jupiter spoke, the beetle became visible at the end of the string. It hung quite clear of any branches and glistened like a glob of polished gold in the last rays of the setting sun. "All right, Jupiter, let it fall," shouted Legrand, carefully now. The insect fell like a heavy weight at our feet. Legrand immediately drove a peg into the ground precisely at the spot where the beetle fell. "Well done, Jupiter. You can come down now." While the old man was clambering down, Legrand took a tape measure from his pocket. Fastening one end of it to the tree trunk on the side nearest the peg, he unrolled it until it reached the peg. Then he unrolled it farther in the same direction, continuing in a straight line 50 feet past the peg. There he drove a second peg into the ground. Using this second peg as a center and the tape measure as a compass, he scratched a circle about 4 feet in diameter in the dirt. Then Legrand picked up one of the spades and, giving the others to Jupiter and to me, begged us to dig inside this circle as quickly as possible. To tell the truth, I did not particularly enjoy digging at any time, and at that moment I would have preferred to refuse. Night was coming on. It had been a long day for me. I was already quite tired from the long climb, and I did not look forward to the hike back in pitch darkness. But I saw no way out, and I was afraid it would disturb my poor friend's mental balance if I refused. It seemed to me that Legrand, in his illness, was believing some southern superstitions about buried money, and his fantasy had probably been fed by finding the scarab, or perhaps by Jupiter's idea that it was a bug of real gold. A mind on the brink of insanity would easily be led by such suggestions. I recalled the poor fellow's speech about the beetles being the key to his fortune. I was sadly disturbed about his condition, but I decided that the best thing would be to dig willingly. I would do what I could to hasten the moment when we could convince Legrand, by finding nothing, that his hopes were in vain. We lit lanterns and fell to work with a zeal worthy of a more sensible project. We dug steadily, talking little. The only sounds were the thuds of the earth as it dropped from our shovels, and the yelpings of the dog, who took great interest in our activity. After about 2 hours we had reached a depth of 5 feet. But there was no sign of any treasure. I began to hope that the game was over. Legrand, however, evidently much distressed, insisted that we enlarge the circumference of the circle and dig some more. Still nothing appeared. Legrand finally climbed out of the pit, with the bitterest disappointment on his face. I gladly followed him. Jupiter began to gather up the tools with Wolf at our heels. We silently turned toward home. We had taken no more than a dozen steps in this direction when, with a loud oath, Legrand turned on Jupiter and seized him by the collar. "You scoundrel!" he hissed from between his clenched teeth. "You infernal villain! Speak, I tell you! Tell me this instant! Which is your left eye?" The astonished fellow opened his eyes and mouth to the fullest, dropped the spades, and trembled on shaky knees. "Oh, Mr. Will, ain't this here my left eye?" stammered the terrified Jupiter, placing his hand upon his right eye. "I thought so! I knew it!" exclaimed Legrand, letting Jupiter go and jumping about in excitement. "Come, we must go back. There's no time to lose." and he again led the way to the tulip tree. "Jupiter, come here," he ordered when he reached the tree. "Was the skull nailed to the branch with the face outward, or with the face toward the tree?" "The face was out, Mr. Will." "Well then," said Legrand, touching each of Jupiter's eyes, "was it this eye or that through which you dropped the beetle?" "It was this eye, the left one, just as you told me," and here Jupiter pointed to his right eye. "Good. You must try it again." Now I thought I saw some method to my friend's madness. He took the peg marking the spot where the beetle first fell and moved it about 3 inches to the west. Then he fastened the tape measure to the tree trunk and unrolled it again to the peg. As before, he continued it in a straight line to the distance of 50 feet and drove in the second peg. This new spot was several yards away from the point at which we had been digging before. Here we marked a new circle and again began to dig. I was dreadfully weary, but strangely I no longer felt any distaste for the work. I had become most interested, even I must admit excited. I now dug eagerly and found myself looking expectantly for the imagined treasure. When we had been at work perhaps an hour and a half, Wolf suddenly leaped into the hole, tearing up the ground frantically with his claws. In a few seconds he had uncovered a mass of human bones, forming 2 skeletons. 1 or 2 strokes of a spade revealed the blade of a large Spanish knife, and, as we dug further, 3 or 4 loose pieces of gold coins came to light. At the sight of these, Jupiter could scarcely contain his joy. Legrand, however, still looked extremely disappointed. "Come on," he urged us. "Keep digging." The words were hardly out of his mouth when the toe of my boot got caught in something. I stumbled and fell forward into the loose earth. Scrambling to my feet, I brushed myself off and looked down to see what I had stumbled against. It was a large iron ring, half buried, rusty, and encrusted with earth. Part 3. Links in a Chain. Now we all worked feverishly. Never had I been so excited. In a few minutes we unearthed a rectangular wooden chest about 3.5 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. It was bound around on all sides with straps of rusty iron. On each side of the chest, near the top, were 3 iron rings, large enough for a hand to grasp, 6 in all. It was on one of these rings that I had stumbled. 6 men could have carried the chest by means of those rings, and all their strength would have been needed for the task. The chest was so heavy that our combined efforts served only to shift its position very slightly. We saw at once that it would be impossible to remove so great a weight. Fortunately, the lid was fastened only by 2 sliding bolts. Trembling and panting with anxiety, we slid back the bolts. In an instant, a treasure of incalculable value lay gleaming before us. The rays of our lanterns fell onto a confused heap of gold and jewels with a glare that absolutely dazzled our eyes. Jupiter fell upon his knees in the pit and buried his naked arms up to the elbows in the gold. At length, with a deep sigh, he exclaimed, "And all this came from the gold bug." After much confusion as to what to do next, we decided that we had to remove the treasure before daylight. It would take 2 trips to get everything from the pit and across to the island. First, we removed 2/3 of the box's contents so that we could raise it from the hole. The articles taken out were left hidden among the bramble bushes, and Wolf was left to guard them, with strict orders from Jupiter not to move or open his mouth until our return. The 3 of us hastened toward the island with the chest, glad now of the dark night that concealed us. We reached Legrand's hut safely at 1 o'clock in the morning. We were too exhausted to start back immediately, so we rested until 2 o'clock, then had a quick supper and started back for the hills. Luckily, there were 3 strong sacks in the hut, and we took them with us. We arrived at the pit a little before 4 o'clock and found everything as we had left it. We divided the remainder of the treasure as equally as possible among us and again set out for the hut, Wolf at our heels. We reached it and deposited our golden burdens just as the first faint streaks of dawn gleamed from over the tree-tops in the east. We were now thoroughly exhausted, but we were too excited to sleep. After a few hours' rest, we all arose to examine our treasure. The chest had been full to the brim, and it took all that day and the greater part of the night to sort its contents. We found even vaster wealth than we had at first supposed. There was a great variety of antique gold coins, French, Spanish, German, and English, which we estimated to be worth $150,000. There was, however, no American money. Some of the coins were extremely large and heavy, but so worn that we could not read their inscriptions. Then there were jewels,
large, fine diamonds, 110 in all, 18 brilliant rubies, 310 emeralds, all very beautiful, 21 sapphires, and 1 opal. These precious stones had all been broken from the gold settings of rings, neck pieces, and pins they had once belonged to, and had been thrown loose into the chest. When we picked these gold pieces out from among the other gold, we saw that they had been beaten with hammers to prevent anyone's identifying them. That was obviously the reason why the stones had been removed, too. Besides all this, there was a vast quantity of solid gold ornaments, nearly 200 finger rings and earrings, many rich chains, 83 large heavy crosses, an enormous golden punch bowl, richly ornamented, and many other smaller articles. The weight of these valuables were more than 350 pounds. And then there was 197 superb gold watches, 3 of them being worth $500 each. All were very old, and, as timekeepers, quite useless, since their works had corroded while they were buried in the damp earth. But all were richly jeweled and set in cases of gold. We estimated that the entire contents of the chest was worth $1.5 million. Later, when we sold most of the treasure, keeping a few trinkets and jewels for our own use, we found that we had greatly underestimated its worth. "Legrand, my dear friend," I kept asking impatiently while we sorted and exclaimed over our find, "how did you know?" "Later, later," he kept replying. His pallor and melancholy, I was glad to note, had certainly disappeared, and neither Jupiter nor I were worried any longer about his mental health. Finally, we were done. "Now you must explain," I insisted. "Very well," said Legrand. "You remember that night I showed you the rough sketch of the beetle? You insisted that it resembled a death's head. At first, I thought you were making fun of my artistic talent, and I was annoyed at you. So, when you returned the scrap of parchment to me, I started to crumple it up and throw it into the fire." "The scrap of paper, you mean?" I asked. "It did look like paper, but when I was drawing on it, I realized it was very thin parchment. It was quite dirty, you remember? Well, just as I was about to crumble it up, I happened to glance at the sketch I had drawn. You can imagine my astonishment when I saw a drawing of a death's head, but it was not in the place where I had drawn the beetle. I knew that my design was very different, although there was a certain similarity in the general outline. If you remember, I took a candle and went to the far end of the room to study the parchment more closely. Then, when I turned the parchment over, I saw my own sketch on the other side, just as I had made it. At first I was merely surprised at the remarkably similar outlines. It seemed just a strange coincidence that, unknown to me, there was a skull on the other side, immediately beneath my drawing of the scarab. But gradually I realized something that startled me even more." "What was that?" I asked, dying with impatience for a solution of this most extraordinary riddle. "I suddenly remembered that there positively had not been anything on the parchment when I first made my drawing. I remembered that I had pulled the scrap from my pocket and turned it first to one side, then to the other to find the cleanest spot. If the skull had been there, of course I would have noticed it. I decided to give the matter closer attention later that night, after you left and when Jupiter would be asleep. That is why I did not press you to spend the night, as you planned at first. In the meantime, I locked the parchment safely away in my writing desk. First, I considered how I had found the parchment. We discovered the beetle on the mainland coast, a short distance above the high water mark. When I had picked it up, the beetle gave me a sharp bite, so I let it drop. Jupiter, who was always cautious, looked about for a leaf or something with which to take hold of it. At this moment, we both spotted the scrap of parchment, which I then thought was paper. It was half buried in the sand, with only one corner sticking up. Nearby, I noticed the rotting wood of what appeared to have been the hull of a ship's longboat. The wreck must have been there for a very long time. Anyway, Jupiter picked up the parchment, wrapped the beetle in it, and gave it to me. On the way home, we met Lieutenant Gray. I showed him the insect, and he asked if he could take it home to study for the evening. When I agreed, he immediately put it in his pocket, without the parchment in which it had been wrapped, the parchment which I continued to hold in my hand during our conversation. Perhaps Lieutenant Gray thought I would change my mind about letting him borrow the beetle if we talked too long. You know how enthusiastic he is on all subjects connected with natural science. So he quickly left, and I must have absent-mindedly put the parchment in my pocket. Now, remember when I wanted to sketch the beetle for you? There was no paper on the table. I searched my pockets, hoping to find an old letter or something to draw upon, and my hand came up with the parchment.
"But," I interrupted, "you say that the skull was not there when you made the drawing of the beetle."
I was just coming to that. That's the key to the whole mystery, replied Legrand. When I gave you the drawing, I watched you carefully when you returned it, and I knew that you did not draw the skull. Of course not. And no one else could have either. Then how? I began. But Legrand was already talking. At that point, I made an effort to remember everything that took place that afternoon and evening. The weather was chilly, a rare and happy accident, and we had lit the fire. You were seated near it. Just as you were about to inspect my drawing, Wolf entered and leaped upon your shoulders. You petted him and kept him off with your left hand, while your right hand held the parchment out of his reach. Because of where you were sitting, your right hand came very close to the fire. In fact, I recall that at one moment I thought the blaze had caught it. But just then Wolf jumped down, and you began to study the sketch. When I thought about all these details, it became clear to me that the heat of the fire must have brought out the drawing of the skull. You know that it is possible to write with some chemicals so that the writing cannot be seen until the action of heat or fire makes the words visible? Yes, of course I know that. Well, you may not believe this, but I had already made a kind of connection. I had put together 2 links of a great chain. I found the remains of an old boat lying along the sea-coast, and not far from the boat was the parchment, not paper, that Jupiter had used to pick up the beetle. But what is the connection? First, you know that the skull, or death's head, is the well-known emblem of pirates, their flags. Yes, everyone knows that, I said impatiently. Second, parchment is very durable, lasts almost forever. But for the usual kind of drawing or writing, it is not nearly as easy to use as ordinary paper. So parchment would only be used for an important message, something that would be kept as a permanent record, something that would not be easily damaged. So I concluded that there must be some meaning in the death's head being drawn on the parchment with some invisible chemical. Then the size and the shape of the parchment supported my idea. Even though one corner was torn off, the original form was oblong, just the size and shape that might have been used for a memorandum, for a record of something to be long remembered and carefully saved. But there was no memorandum, only the death's head, I argued. I studied it closely. So did I, continued Legrand. I saw that the part of the drawing nearest to the edge of the parchment was more distinct than the rest, so the action of the heat must have been uneven. I immediately kindled a fire and held every portion of the parchment over it. At first, some of the lighter lines in the skull became darker. Then in one corner of the parchment, a small drawing became visible. At first, it looked like a goat. Then I looked more carefully and saw it was a kid. Ha ha! I laughed. To be sure, I have no right to laugh at you. $1.5 million of money is not a joke, but you can't make any connection between goats and pirates. Pirates have nothing to do with goats. But I have just said that the figure was a kid, not a goat. Kids, goats, it's pretty much the same thing. Pretty much, but not altogether, replied Legrand. Of course you've heard of Captain Kidd. I realized at once that the animal drawing at the bottom of the parchment was a kind of a punning signature, a humorous way of writing a name. The skull at the top was a sort of a seal or letterhead, so that was the third link, but I was most distressed because there was nothing else. I suppose you expected to find a letter between the seal and the signature? Something like that. The fact is, I had a feeling of some vast good fortune about to happen. I can't say why. Perhaps, after all, it was more wishful thinking than anything else, and Jupiter's silly words about the bug being of solid gold kept running through my head. And then there was the strange coincidences, that this should all happen on the one full day in the year which was cool enough for a fire, and that without the fire, without lending the beetle to Lieutenant Gray, or without the dog coming in at the very moment, or indeed without your unexpected visit, I should never have become aware of the death's head. Go on, please. I can't wait to learn how you figured it out. You know all the stories, the 1,000 vague rumors about Kidd burying money somewhere along the Atlantic coast? Well, I believe that those thousands of rumors must have had some basis, and the fact that the rumors were all so similar and had lasted so long to mean that the buried treasure was still buried. Remember, all those stories were about money seekers, not about money finders. If Kidd had hidden the treasure and afterward recovered it, the rumors would not have lasted. Have you ever heard of any important treasure being unearthed along the coast? Never. Exactly, so I took it for granted that the earth still held it. Kidd certainly had intended to claim his treasure. All the stories about him attest to that. So I decided that some accident must have prevented him from recovering it. This accident must have been known to his followers, who then tried to find it themselves, but they could not. because they had no way of knowing where it was either. Probably it was all this digging and prowling that led to all the rumors in the first place. Now suppose that the reason Kidd did not go back for the treasure was, let us say, the loss of a memorandum indicating its location. And so you guessed? Exactly, that the parchment I had so strangely found was the lost record of the place of burial. But how did you proceed? I held the parchment to the fire again, but nothing happened. I thought that the coating of the dirt on it might be in the way, so I carefully rinsed the parchment in warm water and placed it in a pan over lighted charcoal. In a few minutes I saw just what you see now.
Part 4. Cracking Captain Kidd's Code. Legrand had been heating the parchment again as he spoke, and now he handed it to me. A group of mysterious symbols in a reddish ink was neatly arranged in the center of the parchment between the skull and the goat. But, I said, as I returned the parchment to him, I am as much in the dark as ever.
The solution, answered my friend, is not as difficult as it seems at first glance. From what I've heard about Kidd, he wasn't a particularly clever man, so I was sure he couldn't have come up with a really complicated code. But even a simple one would appear, to an uneducated sailor hunting for the treasure, to be a complete puzzle.
And you really solved it?
Easily. I have always been interested in such riddles, and I have solved others 1,000 times harder. After all, one human being cannot invent a puzzle which other human beings would be unable to solve. In all secret writings, the first problem is to discover the language of the code. Generally, trial and error is the only way, but here the signature gave it away immediately. The pun upon the word kid occurs only in English. Otherwise, I would have tried French and Spanish first, since Kidd was a pirate of the Spanish Main. Of course, the problem is that, as you can see, there are no divisions between the words. If there were, it would have been clear that a word of one symbol would be a or I, and a word of two symbols could be is, if, it, or he. But since there were no word divisions, my first step was to count all of the symbols to see which were the most frequent and which the least frequent. I arranged the symbols into a table like this. Of the characters 8, there are 33. Of semicolon, there are 26. Of 4, there are 19. Of double cross and close parentheses, there are 16. Of asterisks, there are 13. Of 5, there are 12. Of 6, there are 11. Of open parentheses, there are 10. Of cross and 1, there are 8. Of 0, there are 6. Of the characters 9 and 2, there are 5. Of colon and 3, there are 4. Of question mark, there are 3. Of paragraph mark, there are 2. And of exclamation and hyphen, there are only 1. Now in English, the letter E occurs most frequently. E is so frequent, in fact, that there is practically never a sentence of any length in which it is not the most repeated letter. After that, the most frequent letters in order are A, O, I, D, H, N, R, S, T, U, Y, C, F, G, L, M, W, B, K, P, Q, X, Z. So in this code, I felt I was on very safe ground by assuming that the letter 8 represents E. There's an easy way to check this out. E is very often doubled in English, in such words as meet, fleet, speed, agreed, and so on. No other letter is doubled so often,
I said, following his explanation easily. I see here that the double 8 appears 5 times in this message.
Exactly. So we can be pretty sure 8 is E. Now, of all words in the language, the is the most common. So if there are 3 symbols repeated several times in the same order, with the last symbol being 8, they probably represent the word the.
And so there are, I said, as excited as though it were my own discovery, I see 7 such arrangements.
Yes, the symbols are semicolon 4, 8. So we may assume that semicolon represents T, 4 represents H, and 8 represents E. Now that we have established a single word, we can also establish the beginnings and endings of several other words. Look, for instance, on the 5th line of the message where the combination semicolon 48 occurs and is followed by a semicolon. We know that the semicolon must be the beginning of the next word, and we already know 5 of the 6 symbols after this the. They are semicolon, opening parentheses, 88, semicolon 4. We know that semicolon is T, we don't know open parentheses, and we know that 88 is EE and 4 is H. If we write them down, leaving a space for the one unknown letter, we have Now, by trying the entire alphabet, I cannot find any letter to fit the space to make one word ending with TH, so I assume that the TH is part of the next word, leaving T. By going through the alphabet, I found the letter R is the best possibility to fill the space after T. That gives us tree, and we learn that R is represented by open parentheses. Looking for the next combination of semicolon 48, we find the repeated again 7 symbols after the tree. The tree, semicolon, 4, double cross, question mark, 34, the. Substituting the natural letters where we know them, it looks like this, and he wrote, the tree, THR, double cross, question mark, 3H, the. As soon as I saw what he had written, I could guess the missing letters, AUG, through, of course. And so we have 3 new letters, I said. A, U, and G, represented by double cross, question mark, and 3, right? Right. Now let's look through the message for combinations of symbols we know. On the second line of the message, this arrangement appears. Double cross 83, open parentheses 88. Substituting the letters we know, we get cross, EGREE. This looks very much like the word degree, and gives us another letter, D, represented by the symbol cross. Still on the second line, 4 symbols beyond the word degree, we see the combination semicolon 46, open parentheses, semicolon 88, asterisk. Substituting the letters we know and leaving a space for the unknown, it looks like this, TH6RTEE asterisk. This immediately suggests the word 13. That gives us 2 new letters, I and N, repeated by 6 and asterisks. I cried. Correct, said Legrand. Now look at the very beginning of the message. See the combination. 53, double cross, cross. We know that 3 double cross, cross are 5 good. So we guess that the first letter is A, and that the first 2 words of the message are A good. Now we have quite a few letters, so we can write down our key in the table to avoid confusion. As he spoke, Legrand was writing. 5 represents A, cross represents D, 8 represents E, 3 represents G, 4 represents H, 6 represents I, asterisk represents N, double cross represents O, open parentheses represents R, semicolon represents T, question mark represents U. We don't have to go any further, he said. You see for yourself how it works, so here is the full translation of the message, and he handed me these words. A good glass in the bishop's hostel, in the devil's seat 41 degrees and 13 minutes northeast, and by North Main branch, 7th limb, east side, shoot from the left eye of the death's head, a bee-line from the tree through the shot 50 feet out. But, I said after reading it, even this translation still leaves me in the dark. What is the meaning of all this stuff about a devil's seat and a bishop's hostel? It also left me in the dark for a few days, replied Legrand. Then I asked all over Sullivan's Island and the mainland about any building that was called Bishop's Hotel, for of course I dropped the old-fashioned word hostel. But I got no information. One morning I got the idea that this might refer to a family named Bessop. They have owned an old plantation about 4 miles north of the island for well over a century. So I went over to the mainland and asked some of the older people who worked there. One of the most aged of the women said she had heard of a place known as Bessop's Castle. She agreed to take me there, but said that it was neither a castle nor a hotel. It was just a high rock. I offered to pay her well for her trouble, and we found the spot without much difficulty. Then I sent her back. The castle was a cluster of cliffs and rocks, one of them extremely high. I climbed to the top, but then felt completely at a loss. I couldn't imagine what to do next. While I stood on that rock thinking it over, my eyes fell upon a narrow ledge on the eastern side of the rock. It was about a yard below me. It stuck out about 18 inches and was only about a foot wide. The shape of the cliff just above it made it look something like one of those old hollowed-back chairs people used to have. "The devil's seat!" I exclaimed. "Just what I thought," he answered. And then the full secret of the riddle dawned on me. A good glass, I knew, could only be a telescope, for the word glass is used the way by sailors. I realized at once that a telescope was to be used from this exact location. The instructions for the angle at which to hold it were very precise. The phrases 41 degrees and 13 minutes and northeast and by north were clearly directions for leveling the telescope. At these discoveries I was, you can be sure, Greatly excited, I hurried home, got my telescope, and returned to the rocky cliff at once. I let myself down to the ledge and found it was possible to sit upon it in only one position. This confirmed my idea. Then I used the telescope. With my pocket compass I made sure of the northeast and by north direction, and pointed the glass as nearly at an angle of 41 degrees as I could by guesswork. I moved it cautiously up and down very slowly until I saw a circular opening in the leafy top of the tallest tree in the distance. In the center of this clearing there seemed to be a white spot, but at first I could not make out what it was. I adjusted the focus of the telescope and looked again. It was a human skull. "The death's head," I exclaimed. With this discovery the puzzle was solved. The phrase main branch, seventh limb, east side could only mean the position of the skull upon the tree, and shoot from the left eye of the death's head had to mean to drop a bullet from the left eye socket to the skull. Then a bead line, or in other words a straight line, drawn from the nearest point of the trunk through the shot, or spot where the bullet fell, and continued for 50 feet out, would indicate a definite point, and I thought it at least possible that beneath this point something of value was hidden. "This is all quite clear," I said, "although very clever, quite ingenious. When you left the Bessop's castle, what then?" "Why, I noted carefully the location of the tree and then went home. But what was most curious was that, the instant I left the Devil's Seat, I could no longer see the circular opening. Turn as I would, it could not be observed. It seemed to me that the cleverest part of the whole thing is the fact that the clearing is visible only from the narrow ledge." "So we missed the spot the first try at digging," I commented, "because Jupiter let the bug fall through the right eye socket instead of the left." "Precisely," he answered. "This mistake made a difference of about 2.5 inches in the position of the shot or peg, nearest the tree. If the treasure had been directly beneath the shot, it wouldn't have mattered. But the shot was one of the 2 points for setting the line of direction, so while the error was small in the beginning, it increased as we continued along the line. By the time we had gone 50 feet, we were way off the mark," I finished the sentence for him. "But the way you were carrying on, talking in that dramatic voice and swinging the beetle, I was sure you were mad. And why did you insist on letting the bug fall instead of a bullet?" "Well, to tell you the honest truth, I was quite annoyed by your evident suspicions about my sanity. I resolved to punish you quietly, in my own way, with a little extra mystification. What Jupiter said about the weight of the beetle gave me the idea." "So that's it," I said. "And now there's only one last thing that still puzzles me. What about the skeletons we found in the pit?" "I don't know the answer to that any more than you do, but I can guess. Although it is dreadful to believe in such an atrocity, it is clear that Kidd would have needed help carrying the box and digging the hole. But after the work was done, he may have decided to cover his tracks completely and do away with all who knew his secret. Perhaps a couple blows on the head with a pickaxe while his men were busy digging. Perhaps it required a dozen blows. Who shall tell?" "Indeed, who shall ever tell?"